The behavioral immune system is designed to avoid infected individuals, not outgroups. The behavioral immune system is the collection of mechanisms that enable individuals to detect pathogens in their environment and that motivates behaviors that prevent pathogens from entering the body. For example, it motivates motivations to avoid pathogens, such as finding it disgusting to touch feces, blood, or puke, are generated by the behavioral immune system. The question is not if humans have a behavioral immune system. The current question is how it works. There is a pattern of xenophobic propaganda in which ethnic outgroups are said to spread disease or are likened to non-human factors of disease, such as rats and lice. Some evolutionary psychology research has tried to explain this phenomenon with an argument that I will call the adaptation account. The adaptation account argues as follows. Individuals of outgroups might carry novel, harmful pathogens. Pathogens of unfamiliar outgroups can indeed be very lethal. Think, for example, about the Columbian exchange that included the transmission of smallpox from European colonists to Native Americans, which the illustration shows ended very badly for many Native Americans. Well, if it was a recurring problem that outgroups posed a special pathogen threat, then a tendency to avoid outgroups would reduce illness and increase reproduction. This means that there was selection for pathogen avoidance mechanisms that motivate outgroup avoidance. This natural selection has resulted in adaptations to avoid that generate motivations to avoid outgroup individuals. Hence, as a proximate explanation, xenophobia is a behavior generated by mechanisms for pathogen avoidance. Well, this kind of argument can be found in several studies, but just to be clear, none of these studies that I'm citing mentions the adaptation account as the only explanation. Most of these studies mention additional or alternative explanations for outgroup prejudice. But at the same time, it's very clear that the adaptation account is currently clearly a contender for explaining outgroup prejudice. The key claim of the adaptation account is that the behavioral immune system includes design for avoiding outgroups. A straightforward example of such design would be that the system that monitors the environment for pathogen cues is sensitive to cues that that person belongs to an outgroup. Well, recently it has been argued that the adaptation account has theoretical problems. One theoretical argument against the adaptation account is that contact with outgroup individuals would have typically not posed the threat of novel pathogens. Because ancestral humans most traveled on foot, they would almost never interact with individuals from outgroups that were so unfamiliar that their pathogens would be novel and especially harmful. A second theoretical argument against the adaptation account is that for highly transmissible diseases, if one member of the band catches it, all others face the risk of infection. So, individuals who were avoidant of outgroup individuals were also exposed to outgroup pathogens, because others in the band, those who had contact with the outgroup individuals, would introduce the outgroup pathogens anyway. So the strategy of avoiding outgroup individuals would not reduce your risk of getting sick, but the strategy of not being avoidant of outgroup individuals may have actually had some benefits. There are also empirical problems for the adaptation account. There's currently no good evidence that across cultures the behavioral immune system motivates avoidance of outgroup individuals. The support for the correlation between pathogen avoidance motivations and outgroup prejudice comes almost entirely from weird samples. Fourth, the most empirical tests of the adaptation account are only indirect tests of whether the behavioral immune system motivates outgroup avoidance. For example, most studies have measured outcome variables that are somewhat removed from the presumed output of the behavioral immune system. For example, most studies have measured opposition to immigration. And what is currently the largest cross-cultural study of pathogen avoidance included a measure of social dominance orientation. Although this research is certainly very informative, social dominance orientation is somewhat removed from aversion to physical contact with outgroup members. So we designed a study that tests the key predictions of the adaptation account. If the behavioral immune system is designed for motivating the avoidance of outgroup individuals, then it should generate aversion to have physical contact with individuals that have cues of being from an outgroup. So we tested the effect of outgroup cues and pathogen cues on a DV that is close to aversion to physical contact. So in the experiment, participants were presented with a picture of the face of an adult male, and the male was either from an in-group or an out-group and either had a pathogen cue or didn't have a pathogen cue. Then we measured the dependent variable, comfort with contact, and afterwards we measured individual differences in pathogen disgust sensitivity. We designed the experiment in such a way that we could administer the exact same experiment with an American sample and with an Indian sample. In that way, we could test whether support for the adaptation account would generalize from a Western to a non-Western context. In both samples, the participants completed the exact same task. So, in the experiment, each participant was shown a picture of one adult male. The adult male was from an in-group or from an out-group and was with or without a pathogen cue. So this photo shows a Caucasian male. So for the American participants, this was an in-group male without a pathogen cue. And to measure comfort with contact, we asked two questions. How would you feel about shaking hands with the man on the photo? And how would you feel about this man sitting next to you on the bus? American participants in the condition with out-group targets saw pictures like this. An Indian male without obvious signs of infectious disease. For the conditions with pathogen cues, we used the same pictures, but with added cues of pathogens, that is, wounds, inflamed skin, and pus. And American participants in the condition with outgroup targets with pathogen cues saw pictures like this. An Indian male with the pathogen cues added. For the Indian participant, the experiment was exactly the same, except that the Indian targets were in-group targets and the Caucasian targets were out-group targets. Now, with such an experiment, what would the adaptation account predict? Well, first, if the system is designed to avoid outgroups, then we should see higher avoidance motivations for outgroup targets, even in the absence of cues of pathogens. Therefore, the first hypothesis is that for targets without a pathogen cue, there is lower comfort with contact for outgroup targets than for in-group targets. So that would be, as you see, completely on the right. Well, second, if the system is designed to avoid outgroups because outgroup pathogens are especially harmful, then it would be functional to avoid outgroup pathogens more than in-group pathogens. So when there are clear cues of pathogens, the system should generate more avoidance for outgroup targets. Therefore, the second hypothesis is that for targets with a pathogen cue, there is lower comfort with contact for outgroup targets than for in-group targets. Now, how would it look if there was no support for hypotheses 1 and 2? Well, if the system would ignore group membership and would be sensitive only to cues of pathogens, then we would see something like this. Lower comfort with contact for targets with cues of pathogens, regardless of group membership. Well, the third hypothesis is that, well, if outgroup individuals are perceived as a pathogen risk, then individuals who are highly motivated to avoid pathogens should be especially motivated to avoid outgroup individuals. So the third hypothesis is that there is a negative association between pathogen disgust sensitivity and comfort with contact for outgroup targets without a pathogen cue. And that might look something like this. Well, again, how would it look if there was no support for hypothesis 3? If the system would ignore cues of group membership, but is sensitive to cues of pathogens, then we should see a negative correlation between pathogen disgust sensitivity and comfort with contact for all targets with pathogen cues, regardless of their group membership. Okay, so now let's look at the data for the dependent variable, comfort with contact. recall that support for hypothesis 1 and 2 would look something like the graph on the left. In the graph on the right, which shows the data, we do not see such a pattern. For targets without a pathogen cue, comfort with contact is not lower for outgroup targets than for in-group targets. Second, for targets with a pathogen cue, comfort with contact is not substantially lower for outgroup targets than for in-group targets. Note that we see this pattern in both the American sample and in the Indian sample. In contrast, in both samples, we see that comfort with contact is lower for targets with a pathogen cue than for targets without a pathogen cue, regardless of their group membership. Well, to test the third hypothesis, we can look at the correlations between comfort with contact and pathogen discussed. We see that in the American sample, there is support for the third hypothesis. For outgroup targets without a pathogen cue, pathogen discussed predicted lower comfort with contact. However, this result does not generalize to the Indian sample. In the Indian sample, outgroup targets without a pathogen cue, pathogen discussed did not predict lower comfort with contact. In both samples, we see that for targets with a pathogen cue, however, pathogen discussed correlates negatively with comfort with contact. Now, we did additional analyses to check whether the lack of support for the third hypothesis in the Indian sample was due to confounders. So one might think that maybe pathogen discussed sensitivity did not predict discomfort with contact in the Indian sample because the targets were perceived as very familiar. In the Indian sample, perceived familiarity of the target influenced the slope of pathogen discussed. But this interaction was not in the direction predicted by the adaptation account. So, in short, controlling for familiarity of the target did not reveal support for the adaptation account. Second, one might ask, well, maybe pathogen discussed sensitivity did not predict discomfort with contact because Indian participants had different stereotypes about the Caucasian outgroup targets. We had asked participants to rate the targets for their impressions for trustworthiness, competence, wealth, and cleanliness, and controlling for stereotypes did not reveal support for the adaptation account. So in summary, we tested the adaptation account with 3 hypotheses. None of these 3 hypotheses was supported in both the American and Indian samples. The results do not support the claim that the behavioral immune system is designed to motivate avoidance of outgroup individuals. In contrast, in both samples we observed that participants were motivated to avoid targets with a pathogen cue. Also, in both samples, we saw that pathogen discussed sensitivity predicted avoidance of targets with a pathogen cue. This supports the basic claim that the behavioral immune system is designed to motivate avoidance of targets with pathogen cues. Now, what does this mean? Of course, humans have motivations to avoid outgroups, and it is possible that the behavioral immune system sometimes generates such avoidance motivations. Our research just suggests that this is not because the system is designed to motivate outgroup avoidance. The behavioral immune system may generate outgroup prejudice as a byproduct of design for other behavior. For example, the behavioral immune system might have designed to be biased for false positive errors, to work according to a better safe than sorry logic. Well, just as this false positive bias might sometimes generate motivations to avoid obese individuals, it might also sometimes generate motivations to avoid outgroup individuals. Well, we think this is good news. If it is true that the behavioral immune system is not designed to avoid outgroup individuals, then the good news is that to reduce outgroup prejudice, it might not be necessary or required that we learn to modify or switch off our natural predispositions for pathogen avoidance. So, in conclusion, our research suggests that the behavioral immune system is not by design sensitive to cues that an individual belongs to an outgroup. Thank you very much.
It's unlikely that people in the past have ever been confronted with such great biological differences. In other words, most neighboring groups throughout most of human history is genetically almost identical. So there's no reason to expect that any kind of adaptation dealing with different races in favor
Yeah, that is exactly the theoretical argument that is made by some of my colleagues in Aarhus on the paper that's on the left.
feelings would be cultural. It's very different. Well, it's different.
Yeah. Well, we used, I think, a cue that was for the participants in our research, certainly a cue that the target was from an unfamiliar outgroup. The participant was from another ethnicity, and there were very few participants in each of the samples of the outgroup ethnicity, for example. So, and we actually have also manipulation checks that these targets were perceived as relatively unfamiliar. So, although this doesn't say anything about other cues that specifically refer to being culturally different in terms of behaviors, I think the cues that we used in this study, such as being from a different ethnicity, are the ones that are being referred to in a lot of the literature.
I'm wondering if there's a slight compound in pathogen cues and ethnicity. I just noticed in the one photo you showed, it's easier to see pathogen cues on the American face than it was to see them on the Indian face. And so I'm wondering if that might explain that when it almost solved, that Americans, Indian sample maybe it might be more noise, less it might be more difficult for them.
No, this is. I completely agree that subjectively it seems that the pathogen cue is hard to see on the Indian target, but this does not cause is not the reason for the lack of support for the adaptation account. So when you're talking about this, then the support for the adaptation account in green. So these are participants who saw a Caucasian male, an Indian male without the pathogen cues, right? And in the lack of support for the adaptation account, so in red, these participants saw a Caucasian male without pathogen cues.
Right, my argument is that Indian group will be very certain that there's no pathogen in that, but the American group might be less certain. And so if you have higher pathogen avoidance tendencies, you might, that kind of false positive, you might say, oh, there is pathogen.
It seems that from our manipulation checks that participants were, on average, at least, really noticed whether the targets had a pathogen cue. So we asked participants for all the targets to rate, does the man look ill or healthy? And it's just very clear that we see almost the exact same pattern for the Indian and American participants. So when they see the reversed faces, and there's clearly the targets with the pathogen cues are perceived as less healthy than the targets without the pathogen cues. And this is really not at all influenced by the group membership.
Or by a pathogen.
That's an interesting thing to analyze. So these were mTurk samples, and the American samples was 50-50 male-female. The Indian sample was about 70% male, but I looked for interactions with sex, and there were no interactions with sex, nor are there currently any theories in this literature that suggests that there should be interactions with sex so that we see effects in opposite directions for males and females. So yeah, here the samples then for each of the cells of the design are slightly smaller,